everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Tips for Effective Grant Writing. My name is Linda Halgenseth. I co-chair the membership committee of SRA with Nina Mounts. We want to thank you all for coming. There's just a few kind of instructions that I was asked to share with all of you. First, attendees, please use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen for all questions that you'd like to direct to the panelists. So these are content related questions. If you see a question that someone else has posed and you really like it, you can actually vote for that question and it will move up to the top of the list for the moderator to know to ask that question. So please ask questions, vote for questions so that they go up to the top of the list. If you have technical difficulties, please just use the chat function for that. So those questions will go directly to Jordan. So please use the chat function for anything dealing with technical difficulties. And also please tweet the webinar using #GetFunded or #AcademicChatter. This webinar, Tips for Effective Grant Writing, is brought to you by, again, the membership committee, which consists of Diana Peterson, Laura Finan, Sonia Negriff, Susie Lamborn, Andrea Howard, Olivine Skinner, Sunny Bay, and Enrique Niblet. And last but not least, Meredith Hope, Dr. Meredith Hope. She is a member of the membership committee and she will be serving as our moderator today. Dr. Meredith Hope is a developmental psychologist whose research examines how the contributions of high-risk contexts, such as racial discrimination and community violence, are influenced by the presence of cultural institutions and resources for Black youth in emerging adult health and development. Currently, she is a research fellow at the National Center for Institutional Diversity at the University of Michigan. So at this point, I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Hope so she can present our accomplished panelists.
Thank you, Linda, for that wonderful introduction. Now I'd like to begin the panel discussion by introducing our two panelists that are joining us today. First, Dr. Valerie Mahomes is the Chief of the Pediatric Trauma and Critical Illness Branch at the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development at the National Institutes of Health. In this capacity, she sets the vision and priorities for research that addresses the continuum of psychosocial, behavioral, biological, and physiological influences that affect child health outcomes in trauma, injury, and acute care. Prior to leading the branch, Dr. Mahomes served as the program official in the Institute's Child Development and Behavior Branch, where she directed the Social and Effective Development Child and Family Processes Program, which focused on the impact of specific aspects of physical and social environments on the health and psychological development of children, infants, and adolescents. Second, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sharon Lipperman-Creda. She is a senior research scientist and study director at the Prevention Research Center at the Pacific Institute for Research and Evaluation. Her expertise is interdisciplinary and includes a PhD in criminology and a postdoctoral training in prevention science and PRC and the School of Public Health at the University of California, Berkeley. Her research is grounded in a socio-ecological framework that considers how young people interact with their physical, social, and situational environments, and how these environments influence substance use behaviors, perceptions, and problems. Currently, she is the component director on an AI AAA P60 Center grant that investigates the contribution of risky drinking context to the development of early drinking and progression of problems among young people using a longitudinal design. She was also the principal investigator on a recently completed grant funded by the California Tobacco-Related Disease Research Program to investigate influences of youth exposure to tobacco outlets in their daily lives on their tobacco and nicotine use behaviors. So without any further ado, we'll begin the panel discussion. First, we have some pre-written questions that our panelists will answer. After this, there will be an opportunity for you, the audience, to submit your questions using the Q&A function below. So for the sake of time, let's go ahead and get started. So our first question, I'd like to direct this question to both of our panelists. Give an overview of the role of a PO and what they can and cannot help with.
Well, I will start. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining, and thank you, SRA, for this session. One of the things that is important to realize is that our role, especially in the federal government, it might be different for program officials in foundations and the nonprofit world and in other capacities. But for us, our job is to help build and advance the science as it relates to NIH in a particular area that we have stewardship over. We invite you to propose your projects and your ideas, the science that you're interested in, the training and the career development that you want to pursue. And we can help facilitate your thoughts around that, to help you think about what makes the most sense for you given your career stage. We also can help you think about how you might need to collaborate if something is too ambitious or not ambitious enough. But what we can't do is obviously to write the project for you. Oftentimes we get asked to weigh in on your aims and your ideas, which is fine. But to go beyond that, to tell you whether or not let's say a particular recruitment target that you have set up is enough or sufficient to achieve your aims or not, well, that is a little bit beyond the scope of what we should be doing, because your application will be reviewed for scientific and technical merit by a panel of reviewers, and they will make those determinations. And ultimately, the onus is on the applicant to kind of do the legwork that you need to do to know whether you have sufficient power for your study, to know whether or not you have a question that is testable, hypotheses that are testable. And we can kind of stand at maybe the 10, 15,000 foot level and give you guidance. But then we stop, at that line beyond giving you guidance and acting like we're potentially a co-investigator or consultant on your grant.
Well, thank you so much. So I have a great follow-up question here. So should people wait until they've written a final draft of their aim section to contact a program officer?
Well, I actually like half-baked ideas, I like to say. I like it when applicants send me what they're thinking about so that we can have conversations about that thought process. And before, especially an early career investigator, before you get too far down the road, maybe it's you're taking a path that might not get you funding at our institute or at our agency. So I'd like to help people think about those ideas before they get too far down the road. So once you have your ideas conceptualized, they don't have to be perfect, at least for me. Other program officials have different ways of working. I'd like for you to be able to think enough about what you're doing to put together a one-page kind of abstract or overview of what you're doing and your aims, however sketchy they might be. And then that gives us something to work from.
Thank you so much. All right, so the next question is, um, can you speak to the role of collaboration in the grant writing process? Feel free to provide tips for effective collaboration.
I can start. I can take this one. So first, Meredith, thank you very much for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here with everyone today. I'll can start with this very general and obvious statement that collaboration is important. And I think you should think about it simply as the brain power that you bring to a grand idea. And the more brains you have, the more power you have. However, there is some important things to remember when you think about bringing your team together and having this complementary expertise together, and you want to make sure that there is not too much overlap, because you want to really make sure that you cover all aspects related to your grant idea, which means that sometimes it has to do with the methods, with the population, with the topic. So everything needs to be covered through your team to really show that you have a strong idea, but also strong team to implement this idea. You also want to demonstrate previous successful collaborations among everyone in your team to really make the application strong enough, and reviewers like to see that. It's also very important to show evidence for this collaboration in terms of papers that were published or are under review, a conference abstract, and such other things. It's also related to that important to really clarify and define very clearly in different sections the different roles that the different people take in this grant application. And I also, just as a personal kind of like recommendation at the personal level, want to say something about making sure that you bring together people you work well with, because you hope that this idea will get funded and this group will have to work together for a very long time.
Thank you so much. I have a question for both of you. What are some resources that are available to new researchers that you'd like to recommend?
Well, at the NIH, there is a website that lists lots of links to guidance around grant making, some videos, the Office of Extramural Research at the NIH website. And they have infographics about the grant process, how it is to start it, and what it means to write your grant, how you prepare for writing your grant, what happens in the review process, how your application gets assigned to a particular study section, and what happens in that study section, what happens after you get your application reviewed and scored, and the post-award process. So those resources are really very useful. One website that I recommend to everyone, this follows on the question that you asked earlier about individuals having their ideas conceptualized. The NIH Reporter is one of my favorite websites. They have just remodeled it, but it has the applications and the grants that we have funded. It's our database of funded projects. It's a public database. You can search it on keywords. You can search it by investigator, by geographic region, by congressional district, by funding institute. But this will give you a sense of what NIH has already funded, where we have made investments, and where there might be underinvestments. It gives you a chance to see whether your ideas are duplicative, if we've saturated the field already in funding the kinds of things that you're interested in, or if you see a gap. So it's really helpful to kind of go into your application process having a sense of the landscape, what's already been done, and where your application might add value. And then finally, I'll say at one of our sister institutes, the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Diseases, this is the institute that Dr. Fauci leads. On their website, they have a grants whole portal where they have sample applications that successful applicants have agreed to have allowed to be posted with redacted, of course, proprietary information, but using all the various funding mechanisms, the R series, the career developments, the fellowships, the small business, and they also have the accompanying summary statement that goes along with that application, so that you can see what a really strong application looks like and why the reviewers thought it was strong.
Thank you so much.
I,
Dr. Berman Creta, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so I want to concur. I absolutely agree with Valerie about the NIH reporter. I find it very useful for myself many times. I can add, and I think, of course, there are webinars like this one that are available through different societies and sometimes highlight different perspectives. So it's also good to look for that. I also want to add, there are some postdoc programs like T32s that can be also useful for grant writing. This is probably a more kind of like long process. I was a trainee in one of these grant not grant writing, sorry, postdoc program, but it has a really important emphasis on grant writing, NIH grant writing, and you go through the process of grant writing very thoroughly, with constant feedback and mentorship through the process. And many of us actually submit grant as part of this process. And even if it doesn't get funded, you get the experience and you get like the first kind of like step into that. So it covers so many things. So that's something else that can be, I think, considered for those who really see their career in grant writing.
Thank you so much. All right, so our next question. From the perspective of a program officer, what is one common mistake that an early career researcher can avoid?
It here. Well, from my perspective, I think one common mistake is being overly ambitious. Um, I even remember when I was writing my dissertation, my advisor would always say, Valerie, you don't have to study everything now. You can save some of this until after you get your degree. The goal is to get your degree. And I would say the same thing applies with the grant writing. The nice thing about NIH is that we have this rolling cycle of submissions for the various funding mechanisms. So you don't have to squish everything into your application, because I would say the main critique that I see on early career applications is that it's overly ambitious, that what they're proposing is not feasible. And so I would encourage people to think about the long term. What is your long term, or at least in the next 5-7 years, program of study? And where does this particular question, this line of inquiry, fit within the context of that program of research? So if you're interested in being a child maltreatment researcher, for example, and what you want to do is to study that the systems that engage children in child welfare. Well, what's the first step in along that journey? What's the most important question that you need to ask as you're starting your career in that area? How do you need to build your track record? One of the review criteria is the investigator. They look at you, they look at your track record of research in the particular area that you're proposing. So how do you build up that track record in terms of publications and collaborations, as my colleague pointed out, in these areas? And so kind of distilling down your application to the most important first steps that you can take, and then giving the reviewers a nod to perhaps what might be coming after you get your career development award or your finish your training program, but you don't have to do it all in that one application.
Thank you so much. Well, I want to be able to get some questions answered for those of us on this webinar who are not early career anymore, who are what I identify as advanced career. So the first question I have is, if I don't get funded, should I give up? When should somebody give up and seek out a different source of funding?
Well, I'm of the never give up ilk. So I may not be the best person to ask, but I am always confident that at some point you will find the right formula. Half of the battle is grantsmanship. When I walk through applicants, whether they're early career, mid-career, or late career, half of the battle is grantsmanship. And I walk through the summary statements with the various applicants, and you'll see comments like, there more details are needed in thus and so area. It's not clear whether. And so when you see those kinds of statements, that suggests to me that you didn't write in your application clearly enough for the reviewers to really evaluate what it is that you're intending to do. So I would say that, you know, hang in there with that. Have some colleagues look at your project before you submit it. Do mock reviews to see what you can discern that might be areas that would have a reviewer have questions. But don't give up. If your line of inquiry is really important, if it's going to advance the science and address something really significant, then keep at it. Now, it may be that NIH, for example, is not the place for that application. And I am very happy to help people find the right home. Maybe it's SAMHSA, maybe it's HRSA, maybe it's NSF or CDC. We have shared interests across institutes and agencies. Maybe it's something that an outside or a non-federal rather entity might help with funding for. And especially as you move along your career trajectory and reviewers have seen that you've gotten funding in a certain area a lot, and they wonder what's next for you, why you're continuing to ask these kinds of questions. And sometimes that review might be colored by your, success in your area, and just wondering whether or not you might explore that question in a different way. So sometimes you may need to take a break and go to another funding source and answer those questions and then come back. But that's why it's important to talk to the program official to see what the prospects are for getting your project funded. And if it's not NIH, then there are plenty of other places that might be interested in supporting that work. And I think the most important thing is to get your work funded, whether or not NIH is the funding source.
Thank you so much. Our next question is directed at Dr. Lipperman Kreda. What is the most common mistake in the specific aim, significance, and approach sections? Perhaps you could talk about one specific issue at each major section of a grant and how to avoid making that mistake.
Okay, so, although I want to say although mistakes can be made, in all sections, and many times it is very specific to the idea, to the population, to many things. It will take more than an hour to talk about the mistakes that can be related to the different section. I would like to focus the attention on one, I think, important section, the specific aims. I think the otherwise, I said, it will take the whole time. The specific aims section is important, and arguments in the specific aim should be very strong and drive the reviewer's interest to read the rest of the application. Many times after the specific aims, the reviewers have a very good sense of, how strong the application here is, about the significance, about the impact of this application for the rest of the things that they will read after. So really writing the specific aims and revisiting and revising many times, this is, I think, an important, and a mistake can be done by not kind of like paying attention to the important role of the specific aim. I think it is important to get feedback on this page from as many people as you can. Valerie talked about sharing it with the program officers, but you can do that with colleagues or with other people, and getting feedback about it. This is where you see some inconsistency, unclear, arguments. And sometimes us, when we work on things for very long, we don't see these small things that other people, outside people, can see. So not getting feedback about it, I think that's something that is important to pay attention to.
Thank you so much. So we're starting to get so many great questions from the audience. And so we're going to just do a little mix up where we're going to answer some of the questions that we already have written, but we're going to mix it up because a lot of these audience questions are so applicable to our discussion today. So our first question that I'd like to introduce from the audience is, what is the likelihood that faculty who work at teaching universities get their proposals approved? And looking at who gets funded, it's clear that the majority of funding goes to research universities. Any recommendations that the panelists could provide?
Yeah, I would say that's largely true. There is a funding mechanism, the Academic Research Enhancement Award, the R15, that is designed for non-research intensive institutions. And so I would encourage you to look at the range of options for faculty members to choose. Sometimes what you might want to propose is something that's not specifically about the conduct of research. Maybe it's an education and training award like the R25. So take a look at the range of options that you might have that will help you to achieve your goals. And you might accompany that with a research, let's say you get a research and training award, and maybe you might accompany that with funding for a small study from a foundation or with institutional funds. So you have to think and be creative about how you get to do that. And again, once you build a track record of success in getting grants, in publishing from your work, and you come back to, let's say, NIH to submit an application, those things are part of what the reviewers look at in terms of the investigator and the environment, the collaborations that you might build. So if you're from a teaching institution, you can partner with a colleague who might be from a research intensive institution and consider submitting a grant application. But you still have to do the due diligence and have the foundational work done as well. But those are, I think being creative and thinking out of the box for how you can get funding, how you can build your track record is really important.
Okay, thank you so much. We have another question that I think will be applicable to both early and advanced career. So what advice and encouragement do you have for researchers who are successful in getting small grants, but haven't landed that big NIH, Spencer, NSF grant?
Well, I guess it depends. If conducting research is a central part of your work and your academic experience, and you're fine with conducting small circumscribed studies that might inform perhaps what you're doing in your classes, or that might be analyzing secondary data. For example, we use the RO3, which is the NIH Small Research Program. People use it to collect pilot data and to get preliminary data that serves as a backdrop for an RO1, but people also use it to analyze existing data and answer important questions in that way. So that's fine. If your goal is to do, research where you can study and test a hypothesis and follow a population in more depth and over a longer period of time, and you want to get to that RO1, I think thinking about how you build up to that is really important. But you can be a successful investigator, answer important, compelling questions without using the RO1.
Thank you so much. The next question I have is for both of you. What insight can you give on how grants are reviewed in study sections? Any tricks to formatting or writing that can increase readability?
I, I can start by saying that never assume that the reviewer knows the research or the population or anything that um, is related to your idea. So make sure to communicate really clearly your ideas. It's really good to highlight by having subsections, or sometimes just use bold text for important or main or essential kind of like arguments that you want to bring in. as I said, it's always, remember that reviewers read more than one application for each review. So it's really hard, easy to miss even very important things. So make sure to really highlight, clearly argue your main arguments, and sometimes repeat it if necessary more than once.
Thank you so much. I have a question for both of you, if you would like to answer. How closely should researcher ideas be aligned to the priorities of the Institute? Does it have to be an exact match?
Well, I would say not an exact match, but they should be aligned. And I say that because we want to stimulate ideas. We don't propose to have all of the answers, presume to have all the answers, and we certainly don't have all the questions. They're the broad areas of research that fall within our mission, for example, NICHD, that we want to advance and that we want to achieve. So we're looking for the field to come up with their research questions that align to those themes and ideas. What is really important is that you look at the websites, at least at our institute, the priorities are listed, what's high priority, what's a low priority. One of the things that you don't want to have happen is to do that work and to get a good score, only to find out that there's no home for that work. And that happens, more than I'd like to see. So making sure that you have that conversation with someone, making sure that your work is aligned to their priorities. It doesn't have to be word, for word, concept for concept. But is child maltreatment, is injury prevention, is trauma, is that something that NICHD funds? Do we fund this age group or that age group? Where, asking questions about where the boundaries are, where's the shared interest between NICHD and NIMH, for example, or NIDA, so that you have a really good understanding of where the home might be for your work. Most of us, we work together really well across the lines of our institute, quote unquote, boundaries. So most of us will know if your application is relevant for our program, or let's say, for example, my colleague, Dr. Leila Esposito, or my colleague, Dr. Cheryl Boyce, or other colleagues at other institutes. So we will know because we travel in the same circles and, attend the same meetings and fund the same kind of research. And we often try to help the applicants find the right home. But having those priorities be connected is really important so that you don't find yourself doing the work, getting lost between the cracks of the Institute's priorities and not having a good study, but not having a home for it that will fund it.
Thank you so much. The next question is for both of you. Could you please speak to the difference in investigator expectation between the F series, K series, and R series of application processes?
I'll defer to Sharon. I'm not quite sure what about the question. I'll defer to Sharon and then maybe follow up if once I get a bit more clarity.
I can try. I feel the same, but I'll try. I think in terms of expectations, I think it's just, I think how probably the announcement kind of like for different type of, grants and was designed. So I think if I understand correctly, the question for R21, I think the expectation is to have more kind of like even risky idea that it's innovative and you want to show the feasibility of doing a larger grant that, with more money to really establish the foundation for doing this larger grant. So the expectation are, first, I think significance is important. I think, as was said before, you don't want to find yourself writing a perfect grant without making sure that this is something that reviewer, but also NIH will consider as something that should be funded. But with, I think R21, you can take more risks in terms of, your ideas in order to really establish this line of research and get maybe more funding to really show or go with like more larger questions to investigate. With R01, you are requested for preliminary studies, so you have to show that there is evidence to really um, um, and that it's feasible and there is enough evidence for you to proceed with something that is larger in terms of funding. And our three are probably more for smaller exploratory and and yeah and rely on existing data. Um, and I think, as I said, there are other mechanisms, but these are kind of like the big three ones that are used, if I'm correct.
I would just add that you want to look at the review criteria. You can see that in the funding opportunity announcement. So you know what's expected of you as you are preparing the application. You know what the lens through which the reviewers are looking at your application. So they will be looking for an F series application. They will be looking at, whether or not you're proposing something that's relevant to your career stage, that's appropriate for your career stage. And adding the K series, they'll be looking at the extent to which you have mentors, the right mentors connected to your application. And if those mentors are available and if they're providing meaningful, tangible time and support for you to get from point A to point B to achieve the career development goals that you have. Sometimes applicants will list the names of people that are big name mentors, and reviewers will see that name and say, oh yes, they're a great mentor, but they're so busy, they've got 10,000 other people they're mentoring. Or they might say something like, boy, these letters of support sound nice, but they don't really sound like, this person knows the applicant, or that they will actually get the support that they need to achieve their aims or their career development goals. So I think there's some difference in the expectations that the reviewers might have for those mechanisms versus the R series mechanisms, where potentially the applicants might be a little bit more seasoned in both in grant writing and in their career in conducting research.
Thank you so much. The next question is for Dr. Lipperman-Creda. What are your recommendations for PhD students in their last year as they transition to a possible faculty or postdoc position in terms of preparing for grants?
I think, first, publications, it's always, good. Talking to people that, and, just to kind of like, get sense of this field of, research, joining as many webinars as possible, like, this one. If you're looking into the T32, talk to people, look for first for the options, and also to talk to people who participated in this program, who are affiliated, get their sense about how it works and what may be available, what options would be your institute or agency will be good for you to join. And I think this is kind of like in general, and said, I think it's about also talking to as many people as possible and get their kind of like sense about how they started, and just be accepting kind of like these new ideas and just think big. That's, I think.
Thank you so much for that great advice. So our next question, how do you deal with the situation where you get divergent perspectives from reviewers or different perspectives across your review cycles? What advice can you give to help our audience, both early career and advanced career, navigate the situation?
Well, one of the things that I like to say is that while we talk about the objectivity of the review process, um, it is at the end of the day a human endeavor. These are people who are reviewing the applications. They come to it with their own kind of disciplinary perspective and their own personal lens through which they're reviewing this, as well as the scientific lens through which they're reviewing it. And as Sharon pointed out earlier, applicants are not only reviewing your application, but they're reviewing, in some study sections, maybe 9 or 10 other applications, depending on the size of the study section, size of the application. So their perspective, this is a human endeavor, their perspective might be colored by a lot of different factors. So your job is to present and make the strongest and most compelling case that you can. Number one, that you have the wherewithal to carry out the study as you're proposing it, and that you're intentional about your approach, that your aims are thoughtful and thought through, using the right or the appropriate methodology for the questions that you're asking, that you're protecting human subjects, and that you've considered all of those kinds of issues as you're putting forward your ideas. And even in doing that, Sharon and I could be sitting at the same table reviewing the same application and have very different ideas about the significance of it or the merits of the scientific and technical merits of that approach. The reviewers are not required to reach consensus about an application. Their job is from their perspective and their area of expertise to indicate the scientific and technical merit. And it's often frustrating. I understand that, especially for early career investigators, where one reviewer might say this is a weakness and another reviewer might say it's a strength. But you have to, that's part of grantsmanship. You have to develop the skill of trying to figure out where is the sweet spot, if you will, for how I can tell my story, make my case, and make it compelling enough that people, whether or not they like my science, agree with my science, that they can't disagree that is of the technical merits of it, the significance of it. You're not going to get, the scores will vary across the review criterion. If you look at the funding opportunity announcements, you'll see how reviewers are asked to think about these applications. And there's also a statement that says that applicants, the scores may not always be, high in all of the review criteria, or they may vary across the review criteria. So you want to make the most compelling case that you can. You want to establish yourself as being the person to do this work, having the wherewithal to do it. You also want to make sure that your work is aligned, especially if it's with an RFA or a special program announcement where there's a special emphasis panel. You want to make sure that your work is aligned with the goals of that initiative and tell the best story that you can about your work, as you possibly can. We never know what a review committee together will deem meritorious or not. We never know if you submit your application this time, sometimes you might get a score that's marginal. Let's say I've seen this happen many times. You get a score that's just at the funding level. And then the next time you submit your application, you might get a score that's less deemed less meritorious than the first time around. And so I know that's hard to deal with. Sometimes you have a different set of eyes on your review, on your critique the second time around than you did the first time. Sometimes it's like taking your car to the shop. You fix one thing and then other problems arise. So sometimes you fix one aspect of your application and then it reveals other areas that might either be strengths or weaknesses in your applications. Now that the reviewers have the information that they need to fully evaluate, let's say your methods, they see the weakness in it. And so that score might reflect what they see now in this submission that they didn't see the last time around because you didn't have enough information for them to fully weigh in on it. So you have to, that's why I say never give up. The process of having these rolling submissions and you're allowed to resubmit twice and then submit a new application, do that as many times as you need to. Or think about changing the mechanism if that turns out the mechanism is not right for you. Look at the grantsmanship. Sharon gave really good advice about having people look at your application. Those, unfortunately, those kinds of things happen. But what I don't want it to do is discourage anyone from applying and from resubmitting. You have to stay in the game. You have to continue. You're building your muscle. You're learning how to tell your story in a way that folks who are not familiar with your science can wrap their minds around it and evaluate it. So you have to continue to submit and to strengthen your application for each submission.
Thank you so much for that insight. So the next question I have for both of you, what advice would you give for people who are based outside of the US or for whom perhaps English may not be their first language? What can they do to make sure that their applications receive equitable treatment? And in addition, what would you suggest for international students or scholars or people who may be having different things happening with their lab where it may not be readily apparent to a program officer looking at their application? For example, do they contact the same program officers as their US-based colleagues?
Well, I will say that, first of all, we have no way of knowing when an applicant submits an application, whether or not English is their first language, unless they include that in their personal statement or in their biographical sketch. So the idea behind the way that we do peer review is that it's based on the scientific and technical merit, so that there are few things in that application that allow us to kind of bring our biases in, in that regard. So we would have no way of knowing. So what would be important for you, just as Sharon mentioned before about having people review your application, if English is not your strongest language, then have your colleagues review your application before it's submitted. Organize your mock study sections, let your colleagues look at it, have colleagues on your team that will be able to kind of balance out areas where you might not have strengths, and that's really important. For students, whether they're international students or students in domestic, or I should say applicants or investigators domestically, if you're not from a tier 1 research institution, if your labs are developing and you need support in that, one thing I would suggest is that look at the funding mechanisms for capacity building. There are opportunities to get the right kind of funding mechanism to match where you are. Environment is one of the review criteria. So, the reviewers are going to be looking at if you have the capabilities and capacities to answer your question. And so you want to make sure that you do. If you have some challenges in that regard, perhaps another type of mechanism might be more important, such as some of the capacity building mechanisms. In the United States, we have an Idea States program where we're funding projects from institutions that don't get a lot of research resources and funding. That is run through our National Institute of General Medical Sciences, NIGMS. So you might want to look at that opportunities for funding through the Idea States program. I mentioned the R15 earlier for domestic folks. That helps. For folks who are international, look at the Fogarty International Center's website. A good deal of what they do is to provide capacity and support in low to middle income countries, let's say as an example, where they might build support for research in those countries where they might not have it, so that they can answer important and compelling questions and address important public health issues in those contexts. So the right match to the mechanism, your ideas, your career development experience, your capacity to the right mechanism is a really important step to take.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to let everybody know we have about 10 minutes left. So we're going to try and get at least 2 more questions answered for you. So the next question we have is, Panelists have discussed the importance of being realistic and of proposing something that is not too ambitious, especially for junior researchers. Yet sometimes reviewers will ask questions and for revisions that are beyond their possibilities and resources. How can someone who got high scores but also gets requests to revise meet the reviewer's request to handle this?
So this is about, I think, how to manage kind of, the revising applications. So I want to say first that it is important to read carefully, reviewers, comments, but only when you're ready. Sometimes I take time. Sometimes I get the summary statement, I put it aside, and I don't get back to it until I'm ready mentally and open to really see all critiques. Once I'm ready, I will read it carefully and just as I said, just see how it all happens. And I think it's important to remember that even sometimes, first, I think it's important to remember to be open to this to the critiques, but also to know that it is usually it helps. So even though it is sometimes really different, perspectives as discussed before, that you get really different critiques from different reviewers, usually it really helps to bring it in, together and to make the improvement. You don't have to, really, submit, but if you decide to resubmit again, you want to make sure that you can address all comments to really satisfy, I think, reviewers. And I just want to add a note that it's kind of like related, but not. So I want to say that for me, I think every grant that I've written, and many of them never got funded, and I think really benefited me for the long term in terms of developing my new grants, new idea, my line of research, publications, and even like, just taking different sections. So it's never a waste of time. And I think this is something that you have to think about it as an investment in yourself, that it's not just has to do with this specific grant. It's kind of like more bigger than it is. So I know it's kind of like a little bit outside of the question. I just felt that it's kind of like, something that is important to mention as well.
Thank you so much. All right, so we have 8 minutes. Going to try and do 2 questions before we have to close. I know there's so many great questions. So I have another question for you. For early career investigators who are just starting out, who may not have as many publications, or a scholar who has been at teaching institutions with a long publication gap, where should they start with applying for grants? For example, should they start out with smaller grants before applying to NIH?
Yes, that certainly is an option. They can start out with foundation or institutional grants. Getting that track record is really important, and getting the experience and exposure and doing that. They can also collaborate with their colleagues at other institutions. Use the NIH reporter to find out who is doing the kind of work that you want to do on a larger scale, and reach out to them. Ask if you might consult with or be a part of a team for their research. People are very generous oftentimes, and you'd be surprised at what opportunities there are. And by extension, for researchers that may have been out of the field for a while, that may have not done research, there are supplements to research, diversity supplements, and re-entry supplements. And I would encourage you to take a look at those mechanisms where you find a colleague who already has an R01, who would be willing to mentor you, provide support for you, research experiences for you. If you've been out of, conducting research and you want to get back into it, the re-entry supplements are a very, very unique mechanism. Same thing for diversity supplements. If someone is not conducting research but wants to do that, comes from one of the backgrounds that is listed on the NSF website as meeting that criteria, can apply, or I should say the PI can apply on that person's behalf to supplement their grant to support someone from a diverse background. So there are many opportunities aside from submitting a grant application.
Thank you so much. So unfortunately, we only have time for one more question, but I made it a two-parter, and I think everyone attending this webinar will be interested in knowing the answer. What is the single most important driver of their grant score, and what is the best piece of advice you've received about grant writing that you still use today?
I can start by saying I think the significance, I think, is important, although I think, the higher scores are usually for the approach. I think the significance, because you don't want to find yourself, you can have a perfectly designed study and then you will find out that it's not significant enough. So you want to make sure this is the one. In terms of advice, I think it's about developing thick skin, embrace rejections and learn from them, develop strong team, and as I said before, try to get feedback from colleagues as much as possible. That really helps to capture everything in one application.
Thank you. Dr. Mahomes, would you like to weigh in?
Yes, I agree with everything that she's just said. Developing thick skin is really important, and thinking about the significance, the public health significance. What is your score? What is your application going to contribute to the field? And really learning to tell that story. And to learn how to write your work in such a way that you can make the case that this work is very compelling. What we're going to learn if this work is funded, and if it's not funded, where there will be gaps. And I think that's a process. And having confidence in yourself that you can do that work, that you can tell that story. And again, maybe NIH is not the place where that part of the story gets funded. Maybe it's someplace else, but continue to push your ideas forward, learn how to strengthen areas where there are weaknesses, and learn how to maintain the strengths that you have, and continue moving forward.
Thank you so much. Well, with 3 minutes to go, please join me in thanking our panelists for such a fruitful discussion today. In addition, many thanks to all of you who carved out time during your busy week to join us for today's webinar. In closing, we have two announcements. First, please look out for a membership survey slated to come out early next month. And lastly, I invite you to mark your calendars for our next public webinar that's coming out in February. It's entitled Interdisciplinarity and the Advancement of Research on Adolescents, and it will be held on Tuesday, February 16th from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that we'll see you in February. Bye-bye.